It's nice to see all of you here today. We have had guests here from the Urban Land Institute in Tacoma for a few days. And last year, the city of Tacoma was selected to be part of the Rose Center Fellowship. And along with 3 other cities, we have a group of professionals who specialize in urban planning, architecture, transportation, bringing their expertise to take a look at a neighborhood to see what we can do to invigorate it, make it more vibrant, get more private investment, and to get more people to want to live there. And the neighborhood that we chose was the Hilltop neighborhood, and we talked specifically about the Martin Luther King Jr. corridor, which is bordered by 2 large hospital systems. I'm very excited about the opportunity to hear our professionals report out to us, share their findings, give us a chance to weigh in on what we think about this, and then really talk about how we're going to have an actual plan moving forward. When we were first approached about this project, I said, I don't want another plan to sit on another shelf for another decade. And we have, yes, that's worthy of applause. And you know, we want to take action. We want to get things done. And we know that when we get these recommendations, it is still going to be our responsibility as leaders and people in this community to implement and make things done. Get things done. It means that we still have decisions to make, we have resources to acquire, and we have to mobilize our entire community to say this is an important project. So I'm very excited to hear what our guests have to say. Before I start, I would like all of my council colleagues who took the time to be here today to please stand so I can recognize you. I see Councilmember David Bowe. Thank you, David. I see Deputy Mayor Marty Campbell, and I see Councilmember Robert Toms. So thank you all for coming here today. So at this time, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Mike Higbee, and he's going to get this presentation started. And again, we want this to be a very open conversation, and I am very, very excited to see what they have to say about what I call one of the best neighborhoods in Tacoma. Thank you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today, a pleasure and a privilege, and on behalf of the panel, my name is Mike Higbee from Indianapolis, one of the panel members. On behalf of the panel, I'd really like to thank Tacoma and the leadership team for all the preparation, all the assistance, and all the time that they've given us. As many of you know, we've been here for basically 3 days. Today's the 4th day. And while we're really good and we're experts in what we do, that's not very much time to get to know a community and to engage with it and to come out with meaningful direction for how to revitalize a neighborhood that clearly has the opportunity to do so. So in order to be effective and efficient with that time, the preparation that goes into a trip like this is enormous, and the leadership team is represented on the slide behind me, beginning with the mayor and T.C. Broadix, the city manager, and all the support that this team provided. It was outstanding. And believe me, we would not say that if it wasn't true. We feel like we had the opportunity to really engage and get dirty with this community and understand a lot that I think otherwise would have been impossible without the preparation that went into this trip. So if we could have a hand for the city leadership team, I'd appreciate that. We only have 2 regrets. One is that we didn't get to spend more time in the Hilltop community itself. Many of us were looking for a drink late last night, and we did not have the time to get up there and enjoy some of the hospitality in Hilltop itself. And that is a big regret, so we're going to have to come back and take care of that. And secondly, we understand that you're going to be sunny for the next 3 days. And we're really sorry we didn't schedule this from Thursday through Sunday as opposed to the rainy weather we had yesterday, although Monday was a beautiful day, and many of us had a chance to enjoy that as well. Okay, so I get to move the slide for the first time. There we go. I'm going to skip right over that. I'd like to give you a little bit of context about who we are. I'm going to do this quickly, and certainly we'll be around later to answer questions if you have more, if you'd like more information. But this panel represents the Urban Land Institute. And the Urban Land Institute, I like to call it a developer trade group. It's really made up of folks in the business of developing. And ULI, as you can see with the mission statement, its mission statement reads, to provide leadership in the responsible use of land and in creating sustaining, thriving communities. And everybody in this room has seen good development and seen bad development. You have many good examples in this region of good development, but I'm sure you have some bad ones. And so ULI comes together with folks in the industry and looks for best practices, learn lessons from what we've done well in the development community and what we've done poorly, and then make sure that we get that information conveyed out to as broad an audience as possible. Do that through workshops, conferences, technical assistance, a number of different mechanisms to make sure that we have an active, dynamic dialogue on this very important subject, because at the end of the day, it's about building communities that work for us. And clearly, we're here to talk about that as it relates to the Hilltop community. And Urban Land Institute, I don't think there's a better organization to partner with the city and its leadership to look at how that relates to the Hilltop area. Under the ULI umbrella is the Rose Leadership, I always mess up this name, excuse me, the Rose Center for Public Leadership. And the Rose Center, Daniel Rose endowed the Rose Center to make sure that this expertise, this knowledge, the lessons learned from decades of development, be it commercial, residential, retail, whatever, neighborhood development, that this knowledge is conveyed to public leadership. So one thing for the private sector to continue to advance the ball in its knowledge of how to do this well, it's another thing to make sure that the public sector also has access to this information and can take advantage of it. So that's what the Rose Center was set up to do. And Daniel Rose, a very successful developer, wanted to give back. So we endowed the Rose Center to work with communities around the country and maybe someday around the world to make sure that this information is available to leaders in communities so they can take advantage of it well as well. So that brings us to, and again, you can see the mission here, very similar to the mission of ULI, but with a focus on public leadership. These are representatives, mayors from cities that have been involved with the Rose Center over the last 2 years. Each year, 4 cities are selected to participate in the Rose Center. Their costs for participation are covered by the Rose Center, and then experts like us, although we're volunteers, our cost, travel, time, food, paper, everything that we utilize is paid for by the Rose Center. So this is a contribution from the Rose Center to each community. And you can see that we had several cities last year. This year's cities that are participating, Tacoma, Hartford, Connecticut, Austin, Texas, and Louisville, Kentucky. I can tell you I lobbied very hard for Indianapolis, my hometown, to be one of the cities. We didn't make the grade. The leadership and the challenge had to be defined in such a way that ULI thought they could be effective and partner with that community and make a difference. And Tacoma was one of the 4 cities selected out of a long list. And I think you should be very proud of Tacoma's initiative and efforts in that vein. And again, you see the information in some of the cities that have participated. At the bottom, this last bullet shows the cities that have participated to date. A relatively new program, but one that will continue for a while. Finally, let me talk to you about our panel. They will introduce themselves as they come up to make the presentation, but I'd like to start with recognizing not only the panel, but the staff that makes sure that, again, we're prepared and that we're going to be effective in our mission when we get on the ground here. Jess Zimbabwe is the executive director for the Rose Center. Jess, where are you? Jess? Okay, there's Jess in the back. And just like the city of Tacoma, the preparation for a trip like this is enormous, and Jess leads that team, and then also makes sure we stay on point as we go through these 3 days. Carrie Dietrich as well, and Aaliyah Anderson also work with Jess to make sure that they herd the cats and that we get the job done. And I'd like to thank them as well. I think that my time's up. Okay. Well, it's time to turn this over to the panel. We have worked tirelessly. You'll see that some of us are very tired. and really tried to take seriously the challenge that was presented to us. And that meant getting to know the community, getting the information right, and then starting, and I must remind you, we're at the very beginning. This is a year-long process, and this is really step one. Understanding the community, testing some of our observations with you, the community, and then looking at some steps we can take to really return this neighborhood to its once vital self. This was a neighborhood that worked very well back in the day. And like many communities around the country, it had some distress in the 70s and the 80s that it is still recovering from. But we were significantly impressed with this community and its potential. And so we're going to talk about that today and some of the steps that can be taken to make it a truly great neighborhood. So I'd like to turn it over at this point to Tom Deller, who is going to talk about some of our observations. This is the panel. They will introduce themselves. And let me speak to the challenges. Tom comes up. Come on up, Tom. Our challenge, as written on this slide, is how can the city of Tacoma attract investment to the Hilltop neighborhood? And it's the right kind of investment, and let's do that within the context of responsible land use decision making. Tom, if you could talk about some of the observations of the panel.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning. As Mike said, I'm Tom Deller. I'm a Rose Fellow from the city of Hartford, Connecticut. There, I am the Director of Development Services, which means planning, economic development, housing, marketing, events, cultural affairs, licensing, building, and redevelopment. Just have a few hats. So we come in as a group of people who have observed this city in two ways. We spent a lot of time over the last few weeks reviewing our information package, information that was sent to us, but that gives us a very flat picture of the neighborhood. And we're asked to come here and give you some ideas from a different set of eyes, to actually say, well, this is what we think you should think about, the things that you haven't seen. And as outsiders, we're able to take that risk of looking at things differently. And so we're not saying that what you've done is wrong. I think what you've done is very good, but we're saying, think about these little things that we've noticed as we've gone out and felt this neighborhood, as we've experienced this neighborhood. We've walked it, we've ridden it through on a bus, we've talked a lot to people, and we've made some general observations. And what we have here, I guess you gotta push the next slide here, is the beginning of what we see as some assets. This is a great location, right next to downtown. You know, this is a big city. Just to put it in perspective, when I say big, I'm from a city of 18 square miles, and so 63 square miles seems big to me. You have lots of potential in this city, but we look at this location of Hilltop and we say, this is a good place. It's got lots of good potential with being located next to downtown. Fascinating history. This is a way to sort of talk about what you were, what you've experienced, what it is becoming. But I think that you need to build off of that and forget the things that were negative in the past and think about the things that were good and how you can move forward. We've noticed a housing stock that's improving. As we go through the neighborhood, we'll see a house here that's being fixed up, one that's being repainted, a change. And later you're going to hear some information about what we've observed about sales in the neighborhood. And we think that there's a lot of potential in this housing stock. Small but slowly growing businesses. You know, there's some great restaurants up there. As Mike said, we were hoping to get up to a couple of the bars. We just didn't make it. But we see the businesses as a way to really start making some change. Strong institutional presence. Now, one of the things that happens is, you know, we think about the two hospitals on either end of Martin Luther King. But really, there's other institutions there. There's the churches. There's some educational institutions. There's social service institutions. Lots of good things that you can build off of. We talked about, I just mentioned the hospitals, but also at the end of the street, you have the stadium neighborhood at one end, and you have the University of Washington Tacoma campus. While it hasn't come all the way up 19th Street yet, with the land that they own, it has the ability to really influence the lower end or the middle of the street, just past the hospital, and really have make a change. And you have the housing authority up there that has begun to think about how to do things in the neighborhood and has used their voucher program in an effort to try to stabilize the families that go to the schools. Another great asset, the community health care clinic. Major investment, It's really going to change the nature of that neighborhood with getting that development going, that $26, $27 million investment. And that's really almost the center. When we look at the neighborhood, we think of 11th Street as almost being the center between the two hospitals, and this is just 1 or 2 blocks away from that. So it's really starting to build and make some change. One of the things that we started looking at is what we'll call the east-west connections. Everything we looked at was north-south along Martin Luther King Boulevard. And we started thinking, but what's on the other side? We understand you have topography issues, but there are things just to the east and just to the west that you can build off of that create some connection that help give you the ability to make a change. The single-family homes, we really, really were impressed with the neighborhood. It's solid, it's got its problems, but it is a solid neighborhood and has a lot of potential to help change what happens up there. The college, the community college, great opportunities relative to development and trying to make things happen. The potential transit investment. A lot of talk about how to deal with transit on the street. This has a potential to make a big difference on the street. And you already have your sub-area plan and your environmental clearances complete. But of course, there's always the challenges. And we have to acknowledge those because those are something that we have to work our way through. It's a perception of crime and safety. And I know that perception sometimes is a lot worse than reality. And we need to address perception. We need to understand what people think and how we address it. Future medical growth. We heard from both of the hospitals that they don't see a lot of growth happening. And the question is, if we're thinking about how to build off of that, what does that mean? What kind of businesses? And it might be more, there might not be the ability to grow as the city hopes because of the change in healthcare and how it's going to be addressed in the coming years. Tax-exempt properties, something every city suffers from. Too many tax-exempt properties. Concentration of social services. We learned through doing some research that there's even discussion of expanding the homeless shelters a couple blocks off the Martin Luther King, and what does that mean? Underutilized storefronts and is undermining the strength of the neighborhood. Vacant buildings have a negative impact. The length of the corridor is also problematic because you're trying to create a commercial zone that runs the length, but you may not have the population density or the employment density to really make those jobs, to support the commercial that you're trying to achieve. Topography, as I said, we look east and west. I know the hill goes down the hill. Many of us didn't think the hill was that bad, but people seem to talk north and south, and so you need to think about that and what that means. Depressed real estate market. It's not just here, it's everywhere, and as we get into some other slides, you're going to see that there has been some change in the neighborhood, but that is affecting what happens in the neighborhood. The schools. If you really want to build in this neighborhood, there's got to be an improvement in schools. We've heard some statistics about the school that's concerning, but I think that it's an issue that needs to be looked at. And I think it's the inconsistent label for the neighborhood. We've heard a lot. Is it Hilltop? Is it Martin Luther King? Is it the Medical Mile? You'll notice that we sort of keep saying Hilltop. So those are the points that we wanted to make. Those are our initial observations. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Thomas to go on to the site context.
Thank you, Tom. My name is Thomas Kronemeyer. I'm an associate principal with Community Design and Architecture, a land use and urban design and planning firm based in Oakland, California. And we do a lot of work in neighborhood planning and multimodal corridor design and transit-oriented design. And as you've already heard from Mike, we've just been in town for what now amounts to 3 days, and one concern that any panel like ours has is that we're somehow missing the big picture, and that we're not looking, that we're getting bogged down in just looking at the area of that we're supposed to provide recommendations for, and there's a potential to lose sight of in what kind of context this area is embedded in. And that's why we very deliberately chose to sort of step back and take a look at what context the Hilltop neighborhood is embedded in order to also determine what assets there might be that we can draw from in order to provide stronger recommendations for what you can do within the Hilltop area. I was just going to say, as you can see, but I'm supposed to advance my own slide. So this is actually the only slide that I'm going to be talking to. So, and when we took this step back, oh boy, what did we find? A lot of great assets that we can build on as we're moving forward with looking at the Hilltop neighborhood. And it all begins with the amazing urban campus that you and your partners at the University of Washington, Tacoma have put into place. It's a really impressive campus, and we understand that there are, in the long run, still plans for this campus to grow in the future. And there are some lands the university owns that lie between the Hilltop neighborhood and the current extent of the campus, and we think that can become a major asset to thinking about the Hilltop neighborhood and its future. There's also along 19th Street, if you go further, there is, and we're right in the middle of it, there's the Cultural District and the Museum of Glass, and again, it's an amazing place that you have created here, and it is connected to the cleanup of the Foss Waterway, to the access you've created to the waterfront. And again, by thinking about east-west connections, this comes into play as you think about the future of the Hilltop neighborhood. Then there are other areas that you have invested in, the Theater District. Then the 6th Avenue commercial area, which several people have mentioned as a positive example for what might be able to happen along the MLK corridor. So that's something to look at as an example that you already have in town. And then there are other areas, the Dome District, the Stadium District, where you're actively looking at and are already improving the area, and the connection to the region that the Sounder provides, and the extension of the link into the downtown. We think those are all great assets that inform what can happen in the Hilltop neighborhood. And here to talk about some additional details with regard to the east-west connections is my colleague Gaurav.
Thank you, Thomas. Good morning. My name is Gaurav Srivastav. I'm an associate principal of urban design at AECOM. AECOM is an urban design, engineering, planning consulting firm. I'm based in Los Angeles. A lot of my work focuses around using good urban design to attract and sustain reinvestments in urban cores. I worked in cities across Southern California, across the world, and it's been a real privilege and a learning experience being here in Tacoma with all of you. What I want to walk through with all of you is try to understand the study area and the challenge as has been presented to the Rose Center by the city of Tacoma. We've been asked to look at the medical mile, and so we're all on the same page. I just want to walk you through the elements that constitute the medical mile. It's a 1 mile long north-south corridor segment of Martin Luther King Jr. Way in the neighborhood of Hilltop. It's anchored by 2 significant health service facilities on the north and south, Tacoma General Multicare on the north and the Franciscan Hospital System on the south. Let's spend just a minute talking about the significant assets that the hospitals present to the city and the region. Between the two of them, we've been told they have about 7,000 employees. They represent hundreds of millions of dollars worth of capital investment. We've also been told that the urban core of Tacoma has 30,000 workers. So 7,000 of 30,000 is a significant economic base that is represented only by these healthcare facilities. Typically, what one would expect when you see these significant levels of employees and investment along a corridor is spillover effects. You'd see investments by third parties in storefronts, in retail, in restaurants. That has not happened along this 1 mile long corridor, which is the reason why we're here today. And over the last couple of days, we've kind of understood why that's been difficult to see. Healthcare employees are not typical employees. And I'm not a nurse or a doctor, but I'm told it's a high-stress job. And if you get half an hour for your lunch break, you usually spend that half an hour in the cafeteria, and that's your world during your working hours, and you rarely find reason or time to go outside, which kind of explains why there's this visible lack of investment in the vicinity of the hospitals. What we're suggesting as an idea to the community of Hilltop and the city is to understand that the hospitals are significant assets, but they're not the sole generator of economic activity in the neighborhood of Hilltop. There are other assets in the vicinity of the corridor that the city and community need to look at. And one way to look at it is to turn yourself around, and to do this in a not confusing way. This map is now oriented so that north is on the right. And we have this north-south corridor, which we want to start identifying east-west connections. And why east-west connections in our mind are important is down the hill, the balance of the 30,000 workers of the urban core are located, 23,000 workers just 10 blocks east of the corridor, which is an incredible asset. There are 3 key corridors that we're offering up as ideas. The first one is the 19th Street corridor. That's at the southern end of MLK, just south of the Franciscan Hospital, and it connects to the new University of Washington Tacoma campus. And that's an incredible success story for downtown Tacoma. A connection down 19th Street will encourage the expansion of the university in the future up the hill and bring student life, student energy, and student activity to Hilltop, which in the larger scheme of things is one of the easiest ways to bring vitality and activity to a neighborhood that lacks it. Going down the hill, the community of Hilltop can access regional transit. There is a Tacoma Link station right at the end of 19th Street. If you walk further across, and I think I at least made this walk for the first time across the freeway this morning, and it's an incredible asset that the city has created along the freeway. So, I mean, I would recommend that other cities that have a freeway spur in their urban core look at Tacoma on how it's been able to program destinations along a freeway. Typically, cities just fail miserably on dealing with their freeway edges, and full credit to Tacoma, all of you. The second corridor is an existing major artery, the 11th Street corridor. We already know that the city and community are focusing at the MLK and 11th Street intersection as a key opportunity area, and everything we've learned supports and validates that assumption. Bates Technical College is a couple of blocks downhill from that intersection, and like University of Washington, Tacoma, it can contribute student energy to the neighborhood. Further down, there's, again, connection to Tacoma Link Transit, the vast employment center of the urban core, and then the waterfront amenities. And then finally, the third corridor is just south of Tacoma General, and it's 6th Avenue. On the west side, it connects to the current hotspot in the city, the 6th Avenue corridor, where we had dinner a couple of days ago. And that is a vibrant, active set of blocks that this corridor has an ability to tap into and bring some of that energy to itself. On the east side, downhill, it first connects to Wright Park, which is an incredibly gracious park, an incredible asset that the city has, and further down the hill to the theater district. And we've heard that the Elk Lodge, which is located right there, is undergoing a dramatic transformation. So those are linkages that are important, and I think will help Hilltop in both being able to attract investments, amenities, residents. And then finally, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about another significant asset. And this was, I think, educational for all of us. Just given the history and discussion regarding the cycles of growth and decline of Hilltop, what we've observed is that there is a really stable housing stock, good quality, undergoing improvements constantly. If you walk the streets, as Tom was saying earlier, you see them getting fixed, getting painted. There's an organic upswing that is visible. And I think that upswing in the housing stock and in the residential market is going to be able to sustain the new commercial activity that my colleagues are going to talk about in a bit. And actually, that's a good segue to Terry. So we've identified 2 strategic nodes where private investment can go in, 11th Street and 19th Street, and I know Terry's going to talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Terry Mitchell. I am a urban and mixed-use residential developer in Austin, Texas. I've been in the business for about 20 years, and looking at the Hilltop neighborhood looks very familiar to my world these days. I want to offer an apology myself and the following speaker, Rick. We are not planners, and so our slides look much worse than theirs do, so I apologize. Let's go on to the development opportunities. There we go. What's the most important thing about Hilltop? Location, location, location. That sounds trite, it sounds weird, but from a residential standpoint, whether you're doing suburban housing or you're doing urban housing, it's been my experience that there's 3 primary drivers of housing demand. One is location to employment. That's number one. I've never had a bad project next door to a big employer, ever. You got to price it right. If they're all making $30,000, you got to price the housing for them. But next to employment center, people will recognize that, and they'll self-select over time to be close to their employment. Secondly, neighborhood services. They've got to eat, they've got to go to the dry cleaners, they've got to entertain, they've got to go to the grocery store, they've got to do all those sorts of things. And the closer those are, the higher the value of the community. Third, schools. And sometimes schools are not important in context, depends on the demographics that are living there, and I'll get into that in just a moment. Notice the slide, it's not near as pretty as these guys. Man, if I had known this, we'd had time, they would have come in and redone our slides. But I am looking, wow. Which one's the red button? There we go. Multi-care, Franciscan. When we start looking at, we see multiple employment centers. We see a major employment center, we see Evergreen, we see Bates down here, we see downtown, we see University of Washington, all almost within walking distance or walking distance. So it's a tremendous, tremendous asset to us. And if I were doing a project in here, I would expect and I would market directly to these particular areas and say, gee, wouldn't you like to live 5 minutes from the office? Gee, wouldn't you like to live, close to work? You can run home. It's just convenient. It works greatly. Tremendous, tremendous asset. The other thing that we talked about was pulled up on Realtor.com, and we were looking at, this area here is the Franciscan Medical Complex, and you'll see these are houses that are listed. These are houses that have actually closed. You'll see something as low as $46,000. Down there, that's $284,000, $70,000, $250,000. You're already seeing the transformation occur. People are going in and either tearing down and building a new house, or they're rehabbing a house, and you're seeing the values go up. The transformation is already happening. The market is seeing that. This is a key indicator for me if I were looking to do a new, larger project, that this area is recovering and is going to do, it's going to recover as fast as your economy recovers. And so, a very good sign. If we go to the next phase, this is even more dramatic up around multi-care, closer to town, obviously higher priced condos, but right next to multi-care, $289,000 sold unit, $222,000, already turning. You're seeing that dramatic. If we look at some pictures, this house was largely redone. This one needs to be redone. You're seeing this transformation. A house that's redone, nice yard, that would fit in any neighborhood in Tacoma. Once again, a nice little urban street scene of some historical houses. This is one that we call, this one has lots of potential, but great street scene, street trees, great architecture. Somebody's going to make a lot of money redoing that house. That's just, and we have a sub-cottage culture in Austin, Texas, that people do nothing but this. Now, we have big growth. It's going to affect how fast this happens depends upon your employment and population growth. If you have a lot of that, you're going to see a lot of people wanting to move in closer. But here's another one, great street along here. The other thing, location to services. If we go back to the map, see if I can do this. I just got to catch up with me. There we go. You've got 6th Avenue over here. You've got downtown. You've got the theater district. You have lots of entertaining services here that are important to the community. So I would say today, schools, we heard some ups and downs about it. I do urban projects often, and I don't even pay attention to schools generally, because in Austin, and I don't know how it works here, but in the urban context, we have single income, no kids, double income, no kids, and empty nesters representing 80 to 90% of our demand. I was doing a project one time, and somebody called and said, you know, what schools do we have? And I go, heck, I don't know. I've never even looked at them. So most of your demand, if it's that nature, single nurses, young administrators, people working downtown, the schools become less important. But as those people move in there and it becomes a community, you find the schools begin to improve, because they want to start having children, they want to stay in their neighborhood, and it improves it over time. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rick and let him continue on with some of our next observations. I think it went backwards.
Good morning. My name is Rick Dishnicka. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm a housing developer. I do for sale, for rent, high density, medium density primarily, but I've done pretty much across the board in all segments of the real estate residential arena. And what I'm going to talk, let's see what happens here. I'm going to talk about the first 4 things of density, mixed income housing, neighborhood retail service, and Rite Aid. Let's talk about density. And you have to put this in the context of the neighborhood, what the potential is in the near term, and then you have to start thinking about the long term. But there's some wonderful examples in your neighborhood. This building to the left, you probably all know, was within about 4 blocks of the site, and that's probably about 12 units per acre. The example to the right is an older building about 6 blocks from the site, and again, I'm going to guesstimate that's probably close to 15 to 20 units per acre. Down on the left is a building that was probably built in the 20s or 30s, and we're going to guesstimate that's about 50 units per acre, and that's probably about 6 blocks from the site. And here's a brand new building within the last 10 years that's, I believe it's on 15th and roughly Tacoma Street, so that's about 6 or 7 blocks away from the site. All these represent the kinds of product that you might envision in this neighborhood. Now, I want to also focus on, again, the context of retail and housing. It's very in vogue to have all the ground floor, all retail. Sometimes doesn't work, so you have to be very sensitive to that, because one of the worst things to have is an empty storefront, and I think everybody can resonate with that. So there's ways that you can judiciously use the retail in the appropriate locations. Let me see if I can get my pointer. So just for orientation, this is the MLK, this is 11th Street. We're going to talk about opportunities and where we see it, and you've heard a lot about the east-west connection and the north-south connection. I also look at things in very concentrated small areas. So in my eye, it's this 4-block square surrounding this intersection that should be your primary focus in the near term. As time goes on, other things will start to happen. So then you have to start focusing on, well, what's available on an opportunity. There's a site that is a potential opportunity. Could be residential, could be commercial, could be a combination of the two. You have some parking lots and some low-density activities along 11th Street right behind this corner. This is the senior project that is existing and just built. The city owns these 3 parcels, 2 buildings and a vacant lot, I believe. And this is the infamous Rite Aid. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. So again, to put things in context from the standpoint of density, and I want you to get a sense of the fabric of the commercial side. I showed you the residential. This is the building at MLK and 11th. This is down a block on MLK, single story, very, very high value asset in the community. This is a new art gallery And look at what they've done. They took what probably was an ugly building not too long ago, and they've painted it, created probably some new storefront, nice sign, and everything looks quite nice, single story. Down the street on 11th Street going to the east is a barber shop. That corner's not bad. Leading down to the corner's not so great. Down the next street, which is J Street, is a wonderful little bar club, nightclub activity. So there's kernels of activity that are already there and already going. Oops, I don't want to do that just yet. So let me focus then on residential, and one of the concepts that we're going to advance here is the idea of mixed income housing. And I want to just give you one example. There are many other alternatives, and I'm going to kind of focus through this thing because I'm more of a reader than I am extemporaneous speaker. So with employment anchoring the study area and existing in downtown at the educational institutions, we believe that housing with ancillary support services will be the predominant growth and redevelopment potential for the site. We believe that the focus should be on mixed income projects, for example, 80-20, which I have on the board, 70-30, 60-40, to ensure that there are all price ranges and housing types for all kinds of people. With mixed income housing presently being done in a number of cities, it allows the area to enhance disposable income, support services, and market rate housing. We would discourage entire projects that consist solely of affordable housing at this point in the cycle. Mixed income projects such as the 80-20 program give you 80% market rate, 20% of the units are affordable at 50% of the adjusted median income for the area. You get access to tax-exempt bonds, and you get access to 4% tax credits. Now, many times that's all you need, but sometimes in the early part of the cycle, and you want to stimulate something when the demand is not there and the rents aren't there because the deals won't pencil, then the city has to be more proactive. And things that you could include are, you have a wonderful tax exemption opportunity, there's infrastructure improvements that you can present, you can do things like land write-downs, assuming that you own the land and you have access to that. I know that you'd have difficulty in assembling land, so that's a challenge for you. The thing that I'd like to focus on in the next part of this element, and this is more the challenge to the city and the team, is that it's also important for the city to address title and ownership issues, the condition of the utilities and physical infrastructure, and other process issues that impede the implementation of development. So part of your homework assignment is going to be creating a due diligence checklist. You have to put yourself in my suit, think like I think, and ask yourself the question, what does this private for-profit developer need in order to get to the place of shovel-ready? And I'll come back to that in just a second. Actually, I want to do one thing. I want to just go back to this. Oops, not fast enough. There we go. Again, I just want to reemphasize the areas that I want the focus is to be here. This is where you already have the investment by the Community Health Service going in. By the way, don't forget about one of the great anchors you have is a Safeway. I walked into that store and walked around it at about 7:30 in the morning, and it's well stocked. They put some money into the store. It's a very valuable community asset. So let's look at the next point of my focus, which is neighborhood services. And you see this building that's well recognized on the corner of 11th and MLK. You see this down one block. You see this one that is about 2 blocks to the south and down 11th Street. Now let's come around the corner on 11th and MLK. This is that same building that I showed you, and you're going to come down, you see food service. Food service. I suspect there's a fair number of you that have eaten in this restaurant. I understand it's quite popular and very, very good. Now you have the Rite Aid. But before I get to Rite Aid, let me just make an observation about this type of activity. You know, you need to focus on getting the vibrancy. Sometimes something as simple as a facade improvement, maybe the city can help stimulate that. There's a bunch of vacant space in the senior project. You have to be proactive in making sure that gets leased up. Those empty storefronts are a negative. They're a drag on the perception, so you have to change the perception. So to the extent you can help facilitate that process, it is in your best interest. Oops. Oops. Now, Rite Aid. That's a problem. That didn't look too bad in the beginning. Not a very good streetscape. It looked internal, but it's not the end of the world. It was active. That's what it's today. It's dead. So the other challenge that I'm going to give to the city is to say to you that you need to push that Rite Aid administration as hard as you can push them and provide as best of an opportunity for them to move forward and get that store back open. Just opening that store alone will create vibrancy on that corner and that intersection. It will create some of the positive momentum that you want to see happen. Okay, now, you got to get started. What are the things that you do to implement? Beginning with 11th and MLK, you want to make it shovel ready. You don't want to suffer quality. You want to maintain high quality. And last, you want to think about organic growth. So we've talked about this corridor. MLK, here's the 4-block square we talked about, the health center. There's activity going up 11th to the west, and there's activity that has the potential to go down to the east towards downtown. What is shovel ready? We've basically focused on that, and I said it earlier, the closer you get to shovel ready, the faster the development will occur, which means you have to set the process up. You've got to have all the due diligence material. You have to have the land information. You have to have all the financing, the title matters resolved. You have to have the infrastructure, and all that stuff has to be inventoried and detailed so that when somebody walks in, the more information you can give them, the quicker they can move forward. Quality. Very important that the next project located in the 11th and MLK node be of a quality that sets the tone for redevelopment and rehab within the subject area. Quality active street presence, quality design and materials that make apparent to all that the area is entering a new chapter in serving the residents of Tacoma. Depending upon market conditions, the first project is conceived, some assistance may be likely. I mentioned that earlier, tax credits, property tax waivers, fee waivers, grant money and assistance, just to get this thing spurred to development, to create the size and quality and uses needed to initiate redevelopment along the corridor. Don't compromise your standards. You have to live with these buildings for the next 30 or 40 years. So then we talked about short term, and again, you've seen this slide before, and we're talking about this area as the primary focal point. And at the end, what'll happen, once you get that focal point developed, these are the spines that go out. Organic growth will happen naturally. It is interesting as you go towards this hospital site to the north, that's not such a bad streetscape. There's a few buildings that probably need to be leased, but they are in generally good condition. This is probably the area that has the biggest challenge, but it's not that many blocks long, and there are a lot of assets along that you can work on. So you need to focus on the south over time, and the new health clinic itself that is at the intersection of Ernest Brazil Street and MLK will clearly help facilitate that growth. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Patty.
Good morning. I'm Patty Clare, and I'm a Rose Fellow from Louisville, Kentucky. As Terry and Rick talked about, a lot is that Hilltop exists within a competitive landscape, and we, because 3 days, we needed to figure out how did Hilltop fit within Tacoma, how does Tacoma fit within the region, and looking at that, you know, what are the competitive assets? You're in the supercharged market of Seattle, which most of the rest of the country kind of looks at with like little puppies wanting to be everything that you have in the Northeast. But at the same time, there are pluses and minuses to that. So what are those? I think the biggest thing is we think that that the affordable and quality housing that you have in Tacoma is amazing. And the quality of housing, as we've showed you picture after picture around the hilltop, is a competitive advantage that you can market. The millennials, that hulk of a demographic, echo boomers that are out there ready to move into housing, it should be a target for you, as well as young families, university students, and others. And commuters, we know that it's, sometimes negative to be viewed as a bedroom community, but it is an asset, having the jobs that you have to the north of Tacoma. And, but there's always a but. What is the but? So time after time, again, we have heard that the thing about Tacoma generally, and Hilltop specifically, is that the image and the perceptions are often negative or less than positive. They're viewed as less hip, less distinct, less desirable as your northern neighbors. So how do you change that? How do you take that and turn it on its head? I think Hilltop specifically is viewed through the lens of a rearview mirror, where the past is reflective in today, and you need to lose it. And take that, smash that rearview mirror, because you need to be looking out the windshield and moving forward. So change that narrative, and it is not easy to do. It is slow work. It is hard work. And sometimes expensive work, but really moving and changing the narrative on how Tacoma is viewed within the region and how Hilltop is viewed more generally within Tacoma, and really reinforcing that identity, that strength of the quality, of the affordability, the access to the downtown, access to the city assets that we've all talked about and they've shown on their beautiful maps versus my text slide. And then finally, we think that Hilltop is, the market for Hilltop exists with or without the transit line. It is not, the marketability of Hilltop is not contingent upon a transit investment. So don't get weighed down with and consumed with that, but move forward and let Rick's study play out the way it should with a lot of due diligence. I'm going to turn it over to Roger.
Good morning. I'm Roger Williams. I run a consulting firm out of Washington, but I think I'm here largely because of the expertise I have in community development. I used to manage community development at Fannie Mae and also for the Annie E. Casey Foundation in Baltimore. So I bring a rather national perspective as to what can be done from a community development point of view. The thing that I would like to talk to you a little bit about is the part that people often tend to forget as they get into doing community development, which is who the different partners are and the importance of these partners. I lecture at Georgetown in the real estate department, and one of the things that they always talk about after I speak is that they say, developers will come into you and talk about pricing a deal, but I'm the only one that comes in and talks to you about the people. And the people are an important part of doing a project. If you don't have the support of the different constituents, you really are not going to get ahead and be successful. People tend to forget the residents. You've got to talk to the residents a lot more and get the residents involved. You've got to get the residents to own the project, to get an ownership of what's involved. And I was telling the mayor the other day about, how do you get people to understand and buy into a project? It's like reminding them that there's a station we all listen to. It's WIFM, which is what's in it for me. And if you can really explain to folks, to the residents especially, what's in it for them, and show them the benefits to be derived from the community change, you will have a much better chance of success. I'm going to lump the healthcare providers and the faith-based institutions and the educational institutions into a group that I call anchor institutions, and I'll speak to you about that next. But the government's an important partner, the businesses are important partners, as well as the social services providers. And getting them all to understand what's in it for them is what's key. This is the slide I want to spend most time on, because I think the anchor institutions that comprise the community are the key to what success is all about. I can cite you locations around the country, from Baltimore to Philadelphia to Minnesota, where anchor institutions, which are schools and businesses that are rooted in communities, have an important role to play in community development. What I think has been wrong is that folks have gone in there and said to these guys that this is the right thing to do. I don't think that's the right approach. What you need to do is, A, talk to the leadership of these institutions and begin to show them how working in their communities can impact their bottom line. In other words, showing them what's in it for them. The value proposition has got to be, how does this help your institution? Pennsylvania, the University of Pennsylvania was having a hard time losing endowment, losing students, professors being killed, students being mugged. They turned from having an inward direction for their campus to looking out. Safety was a major concern, but they got involved with building a school in the community, getting involved with community redevelopment. They established an employer-assisted housing piece, which encouraged their workers to live close to where they are. It's a very inexpensive thing to do. It's done with guarantees and rate buy-downs. There are creative ways to do it. It's incredible. At a hospital in Camden, did a survey of the people who work there, and it turned out that 700 of the people in Camden, New Jersey, working at this hospital were interested in living close to where they work. And when you explained to the employers how it would help with retention, recruitment, how it would help that staff when your kid gets sick, not having to drive 10 miles to go deal with your sick kid, but to be closer to where you work, it's a major selling tool. You have examples of this across the country that I can talk to you more and more about, but we're running low on time, so I'm going to speed up. But the important thing is to realize that if you take a holistic approach to community development and you get the schools and the businesses involved, they can have a tremendous impact on what happens in your community. If you encourage these businesses to buy from local groups, you have a tremendous impact again. We have this in Cleveland where they set up a factory to do the laundry for the hospitals, makes big money and does really well, benefits the community, and there's ownership in the community of this facility. So those are the kinds of things that I would encourage you to do. But it all starts with leadership and sitting down with the leaders of these institutions and not saying to them it's the right thing to do, but it's a good business decision to do. So on that note, I'll turn it over to Maggie, my colleague here, and thank you for your time.
That'll work. Hi, I'm Maggie Campbell. I'm the president of the Partnership for Downtown St. Louis in St. Louis, Missouri. We're a private nonprofit membership organization that serves as the leadership entity and the management entity for our downtown. And what I want to talk to you about today is getting people to believe in Hilltop. I think that is a very important part of community building, and it's going to be important particularly during your due diligence period because we're in a down economy and because you still have a lot of work to do to set the table for investment. that you start figuring out how to get people into the neighborhood day and night. Coming up with creative ways, and they can be inexpensive, and a lot of the community and institutional partners that Roger talked about, you can engage with them and get them to help sponsor, help organize, help promote any combination of events and activities. And you don't have to do a 3-day world-class arts and music festival that costs millions of dollars. You can do things like open streets events, which are becoming very popular, where you're closing down streets and getting people to come out as families with their bicycles and their skateboards and meet their neighbors and, you know, enjoy the public space that you can create on a Sunday afternoon. You have an opportunity with your topography to call attention to the hilltop by coming up with fun, maybe health-oriented activities, whether it be fun runs or competitions, either down the corridor or up and down the hill if you're willing to take on that risk. I think that we heard from your faith-based leadership that about 80% of their congregants come from outside the neighborhood. So you have a huge percentage of people from throughout the region that are comfortable coming into this neighborhood every Sunday, and you can possibly get them to come back. Maybe some of them have a long history because of their family history, and they have an affinity for this neighborhood, which is why they may still belong to these congregations. Maybe there's an opportunity to form a community around that history and around those memories and around the emotional connection that people have. You should, I think, look at a national grant program called the Levitt Pavilion. There may be an opportunity here, or to take some of what they've learned as a model of bringing free outdoor concerts in a public space setting to communities across the country. And that may be something that you guys can look into. And I think there's lots of opportunities here to engage your stakeholders, your residents, your institutional partners in beautifying and fixing up the neighborhood. And that's one way that you can start to build pride and instill that can-do and that I believe in this neighborhood attitude that it's going to take to carry this along. When we talk about community building, we have to talk about leadership. That's the big focus of the Rose Fellows' efforts. And it's going to be very important that a broader base of people believe and own this effort. I think that we have seen strong leadership from the mayor's office. There have been a long period of time that this neighborhood has been studied. We heard from folks that asked us why this neighborhood, why the focus on Hilltop, you know, what are we doing in other parts of the city? And when we look at the significance of Hilltop and its influence and its history, that is as associated with the history of Tacoma in general, that close association really needs to be addressed. And defining what success looks like, clearly getting the community to understand what's realistic, what can get done in 1 year, what can get done in 3 years. I think that is going to be very important in terms of managing the expectations of the communities, of the partners, and of the development community. And then working on a very specific timeline and an organizational chart to understand who's going to do what in this effort. So at this point, I will turn it over to Jillian.
It's not afternoon yet, is it? But we are reaching the end. My name's Jillian Detweiler. I'm the Director of Real Estate at TriMet, the transit provider in Portland, Oregon. Just wanted to give you 2 examples to encourage you that this has happened in other places. Neighborhoods have come back. The Mississippi Avenue in Portland is an example. There's a major hospital institution in the area. The neighborhood was a little down and out. It's really revitalized to be a fun and lively place with lots of new investment. And the Greenbush area, Mike, is this in Indianapolis or in Wisconsin, is another example that you might look to for what strategies did they employ to bring back a neighborhood that also had a major medical institution, had a downturn and is on its way back. Just want to wrap up with our conclusions. reinforce the corridor and its connections, really take advantage of the proximity that this area has to Tacoma's successes. Continue to set the table for new development. You need to drill down to the next level to really overcome the barriers for private development. Get the people in place to lead this effort, improving communication between the city and the stakeholders. Organize them around a short-term success. Some development at 11th and MLK, a really key intersection where people can feel a sense of accomplishment, and that accomplishment will spur other investment along the whole corridor. And think long-term about how you could create a development fund to sustain efforts in Hilltop over time, both to get new development and to assure that everything is in place for a broad range of people in the community regardless of their income. And with that, Mike is going to wrap us up.
I think one of the lessons learned for us is we need more women on the panel. Mayor, the women always are succinct and to the point, and as men, we like to elaborate a little bit. So we're running a little bit late. Clearly, you know, as Jillian said, yeah, this is a matter of learning what you need to do and how you do it. Imagine what Hilltop can become, and then act. And really, we think that the purpose of this entire process with the Rose Center and the community is to make sure that we act. As the mayor said, the goal is not just to have it's clearly not to have a plan to put on the shelf, it's to make something happen. So there's homework involved with this. And I hope you know by now, I mean, there was a lot of detail. We wanted to get what we've learned out on the table, have it tested with you, talk about it. But none of this is easy. There is no silver bullet. There's no other way to get a great result other than rolling up your sleeves, getting dirty with this project, and getting to work. So that is what we're here today to start that first step. This is a process. We're taking the first step. There's not a wand to wave and say, okay, let's make this happen. So hopefully we have a number of worker bees in the room, and we're willing to get involved, engage, and make something happen. First, clearly leadership is critical. The mayor has already started to assemble a leadership team around this. We would encourage that to expand. A couple of our presenters today talked about talked about the need. Roger ended up with it, talking about the need to engage the neighborhood, have neighborhood leadership involved, institutional leadership. You're blessed with good quality institutions in this neighborhood. Engage them, get them involved, and the private sector as well. You also have a number of churches in this neighborhood that should be at the table and very involved in the process. Secondly, let's see if we can identify a point person that is seen as Mr. Hilltop in the city, that everybody knows that that's the front door, the window for getting engaged with this process. I have a question about Hilltop. I want to know what's happening. I want to get involved. I know of a development opportunity. I know somebody that's willing to make an investment. I start there. I make the phone call to this person because they're in the know and they're going to be accountable for keeping things moving. So let's have that point person identified and really give this some visibility in the greater community. Generate a list of key tasks to make development nodes shovel ready for development. I think Rick on our panel kind of beat this home hour after hour over the last 2 days. You know, we got to have the data, we got to have the information, we have to understand kind of the metrics of Hilltop. And if we know that as a community and can then talk to the private sector with that data in hand, then we build credibility, and we also take that very first step in structuring investment opportunities in a very credible way with those that are going to be at risk on development. So the data, the database, and everybody being schooled in it and putting it out there in a correct way. Too often communities don't take this step, and they never get to the point of being credible with the private sector and those that are going to be asked to take the risk in this effort. Evaluate the east-west connections. I think that is one of the findings for us. We came here to look at a corridor that ran north and south, and that corridor did get a lot of attention, but we also understood that those east-west connections that were talked about by Rick, those connections really are the connections to the employment, to the services, and they're critical to the lifeblood of the corridor itself and the health of the corridor. So understand those connections and build those up and reinforce them. Conduct focus groups. This goes back to what Patty was talking about. Let's look at the millennials, the students, the hospital employees, the residents, the future stakeholders as well as the existing stakeholders, and let's hear what's on their minds and what they think that opportunity is. Too often a small circle of people get together, they think they know what's best and what's going to work, and there's just a minefield of information out there to pull from and to make sure that we have all the best information and thinking, and we start with that in mind, and it goes back to having the right data. These focus groups and conducting them early in the process we think is critical. And then finally, establish a group to investigate hilltop event opportunities. As our last couple of speakers talked about, programming and introducing the hilltop to a broader audience, not only to Tacoma residents, but to the region. As the mayor and I were talking before we started the presentation, this neighborhood really has great, great potential, and it could be a symbol of the rebirth of not only this neighborhood, but Tacoma and quality living in the region that a broader market will take a look at and say, you know, there's some things happening in Tacoma that I want to take advantage of. And that may not only impact on residents, future residents, but it could be businesses looking for a home for future employees. So this is a very significant endeavor. It's one that has huge upside if done well, but it is not easy. So we start with homework today. Hopefully the mayor and her leadership team, the fellows, the Rose Fellows, will be back before you in the near future, and we will show that incremental progress that then leads to great outcomes. That's our presentation. We thank you for sitting through a long presentation, and I think we do have some time for Q&A, so thank you very much.
All right, so this is going to be the Q&A section, so there will be two parts. So those of us who are fellows, that would be myself, Rick from Sound Transit, Mike Slevin from Public Works, and Ricardo from Economic Development, we first have a chance to ask some questions based on what we heard, and then we'll open up to the audience as well. So I think that's how we'll do the format. So I will start with one question. There is often a lot of conversation regarding housing, affordable housing, market rate housing, how that will affect a neighborhood short-term and long-term. And I saw a slide that talked about 80-20 as far as proportional, that's ideal. So could someone address the impact of putting types of housing in Hilltop now and how that may affect us long-term?
Mayor, we have a project in Austin that's redeveloping our former airport. Okay. And there's 4,000 to 6,000 residential units in that community, and that community was historically a lower income community surrounding the airport. It was impacted by the noise, so the value was very low. Nobody wanted to live there, that sort of thing. And it's now about in its 6th or 7th year of development. There's probably 1,500, maybe even close to 2,000 units there, and it's being implemented in a 75-25. 75% of the housing is market rate housing, and 25% is affordable, but they are mixed in with the projects. If it's multifamily, it's 60% of MFI. If it's for sale product, it's 80% of MFI, and it's worked fabulously. And homes, market rate homes start about $240,000 and go to over $1 million. The market rate for affordable the affordable for sale housing is from $150,000 to $170,000. Mm-hmm. And then in the for rent category, it's correspondingly there, and it's worked famously. But when you drive down the street, you cannot tell which one's market rate and which one's affordable. And it gives us strength into the community. It stabilizes schools. It gives active neighborhood participation, and because of the disposable income, that starts bringing the ancillary services of restaurants and you know, various services there. You need a broad range of income, and it's worked very well in our example.
So to summarize, I think what I just heard you say is that as we look at housing stock moving forward, we want to have a majority around 75%, 80% range of market rate, and then the rest affordable housing if we're going to really help this neighborhood prosper.
And if I could just add one more thing under the mayor, I learned something in the early 80s in San Francisco in a community that was bordered by public housing on one end and very, very expensive housing on the other end in what they called Lower Pacific Heights. And the perception of this is a low-income community or this is a high-income community, the tension between various individuals in a community, and once you start mixing people in an environment where the social barrier starts to break down and you realize that really we're all the same people. Right. We just happen to have different social and or economic differences that oftentimes can be bridged by bringing people together. And I've seen this time and time again in these mixed income communities, whether they're in the broader scale or even just within one specific project, how you break that down and that perception breaks down. So I'm a very firm believer in really implementing this kind of a property and opportunity.
Thank you. So mixed income works. Yes, go ahead.
You know, one of the things that I've learned throughout looking around the country is that you don't reconcentrate low-income folks. You've got to build diverse mixed-income communities which have the chance to float all boats and build wealth for all. If you concentrate low-income folks in the community, you're not doing them a favor, and you're not doing the city a favor.
Thank you. Ricardo? I'm sorry. Okay, first of all, has everyone had a chance to answer that question who wanted to speak on it?
Good question.
No, I think it's a very important question as we look to the future of how we're going to attract private investment. Okay, go ahead, Ricardo.
That Rite Aid building, that is a suburban model in an urban environment. I heard one of your recommendations was to re-tenant it. I was hoping you would suggest redeveloping it. So maybe someone can shed some light on that, my friend from San Francisco.
And before you get into that, I don't know if our guests know this, but Rite Aid was one iteration ago. It was actually a supermarket called Save-A-Lot that opened and closed pretty quickly. So it was a Rite Aid, then it became a supermarket, and then it closed. So it's already had 2 attempts.
The challenge, and I said earlier that you have to do the due diligence, my experience with organizations like Rite Aid is when they make a capital investment, I'm not sure who owns the building and who's the tenant, but let's assume for the sake of this conversation that they are the tenant and they have a long-term lease. They are not going to be willing to give that up. So you may not have the opportunity to go in there and force them. To the best of my knowledge, you don't have the power of eminent domain, and as a consequence, you have power of moral suasion, and that's the best you're going to do. So I'd rather see an opportunity for them to get back in operation. Now then at the end of their lease, when the things start to change and you can get it out from their control, then that's a different story. But land control is a fairly big impediment to implementing some of the visions that you might have. So it may take a while to get there, but and I would say the best thing that I could see in the short run is to encourage them to open up that streetscape. And we've been successful with other institutions like this or organizations like this where you say, look, you guys look inward, we'd like you to try to reorient your store and create some outward look. And they'll be willing to do that with a little bit of a push.
You know, the real first step here is just to engage with them. That's a priority property. It needs to be addressed. It either needs to be activated or a change. The dialogue is going to determine what's possible and what's not.
I think it comes down to economics. I mean, certainly if somebody could go in there and buy it and redevelop it and tear it down, that's great. There's probably a substantial amount of investment in there that they're going to cling to. What we have seen, and this is happening in East Austin, which was historically a lower area, had a lot of industrial property, we're seeing properties like this, that the parking lot on a Saturday morning becomes a farmer's market or a artist's gathering where they sell their wares. We've even seen them take warehouses and chop them up into 300 to 500 square foot spaces, poking holes into, carving openings into the walls and creating artist studios and such. And there's now 85 different artist studios in East Austin, all done just like that. None are original, they're just repurposing buildings. And so there's other ideas that you can use to activate that street, whatever works in that context. that that you could actually use that building if you can convince them to do that.
Okay. Rick or Mike, do you have any questions? This is Mike Slevin, our Public Works Director.
Yeah, one of the things I found really interesting in the study, because working on this area for several years, is we've been focused very much, like you said, on the north-south, and the topography has always been a driver not to look east-west. And I found it really invigorating to see those connections and try to bring the hilltop back into, connect it back into the downtown. Other than the transit that we've talked about as a possible connector, and I know it comes around the hilltop due to the topography, what other ways do you think? I mean, you mentioned making the connections, but how will we reinforce those?
Yeah, why don't I get started, and then Jillian and Gaurav might also have some additional comments. So, I mean, one thing that was said is, maybe falsely so, or in a way that could be misunderstood during the presentation, is the transit investment doesn't matter. I mean, what we really meant is the light rail might not need to happen in order to make some of the things happen that we are talking about. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be some investment in transit, because I think given the topographical challenges, you do have to address the question, well, you're talking about east-west connections, but how do people get up there? And so we think that transit can, and we're talking about bus transit here, or potentially a shuttle kind of service that is specifically branded to bringing the hilltop back to the neighborhood and reinvigorating growth within the hilltop area. So those are possibilities that could be explored. And another avenue that I would add to that is look at the corridors that we've been talking about, so 19th, 11th, and 6th as multimodal corridors. Look at how can we make it easier for pedestrians to get up there, and how can we make it easier for bicycles? And we saw some interesting thing on the web where, there's a bicycle.
Is it an escalator or a
gondola? It is a bicycle escalator, right. It's an interesting kind of thing. And that could actually attract people to, oh, that's interesting. They have one of those things in Tacoma. I mean, it's like something to think about.
Well, just along those lines, in Portland, we have an aerial tram that connects Oregon Health Sciences University with a development area on the waterfront. And when that was originally talked about, people thought it was crazy. Now we take it for granted, and it's just, another kind of delightful thing that makes our city unique. So I would just encourage you to expand, your thinking about that. Also, if you can enhance the connection with the university, you will mentally close that space. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, have walked up either these hills or have walked uphill in Seattle, and as long as the area, the distance is populated with development, enclosed, that walk will go quickly. Most of us in this group have done it. It's not something that can't be overcome.
I just want to underline the role of the university as a transit provider, because often the cheapest transit opportunities that students have are the shuttle buses that universities run for their students. And here we have an opportunity to have a partnership between an institution down at the bottom of the hill, the university, and institutions up at the top of the hill. And a permanently circulating shuttle would do wonders for making that connection seamless.
Thank you.
One thing that struck me, we always talk about cars and traffic, but I think about it in terms of pedestrian. And there are two streets, I can't remember the names of them. One dead ends into the courthouse, the other dead ends into Bates. And if you think about that movement up to the top of the hill, and I'm not suggesting you do this, but I'm just trying to get you to conceptualize it, assume that those were walking streets and not traffic streets, and that you've got these vehicular traffic streets that are the main through streets that are the busy streets, and the others are quiet streets. I mean, that way you start to encourage other kinds of activities, and I suspect you might even say to the people in the courthouse and Bates, here's an easy way for you to get up to MLK and to this zone, and it's a much more pleasant experience. So you've got to really look at it in a broader sense. We tend to think only in terms of transportation and vehicular movement. Think about people, and it goes back to the health institutions. It's all about a healthy lifestyle. I mean, let's get out and start walking. I know you have weather as an impediment, but nonetheless, I think you pretty much get there.
And I just want to reiterate what Jillian said. When I think about connectivity, it's really about the development connectivity. And if you're walking by interesting places to look at, interesting places to engage you, that walk will seem like nothing, even with the hill.
And it's interesting sometimes when you look at some of the decisions that have been made in the past where we cut off pedestrian access. We have a penchant for sky bridges. And so I think that, you know, as this city evolves, we need to look at it very differently because we're planning for the next 50 years, not just the next 5 years. Rick, did you have a question? Oh, Mike Slevin, what is your proper title? I'm sitting here insulting your coworkers.
I'm the interim director of environmental services.
Director of Environmental Services, with all respect to Curtis Kingsolver. All right, Rick?
So, thank you. Rick Ilgenfritz, Project Development Director, Sound Transit. Want to thank the panel for the hard work. Had an opportunity to go through this as a panelist in Austin a couple of weeks ago, and it is hard work. It's processing an incredible volume of information and complexity in a very short period of time. So I suppose the trite thing to say would be to thank the panel for suggesting the Sound Transit study be completed as intended. We will do that, and it will be done properly. One of the things that's we've all heard, I'm sure, from time to time is the tendency to be too close to something. Yeah. And I think in this case, we can also thank the panel for pointing out something we're all very close to, which is the obvious connection of the corridor to the downtown and to some other strategic assets. Many of the assets that the panel identified are very close together, and it's a helpful reminder to me and to my staff that you know, there's a lot of synergy between the different activity centers that are being looked at as part of our study. So that's helpful. Question I have, I was somewhat intrigued by one of the very last recommendations that didn't get a whole lot of discussion, and it was look at ideas for creating an investment fund. That was done up in the city of Seattle as part of the construction of the light rail project up there. I'm wondering if anybody on the panel has any examples of a fund like that and how those were put together, things we could think about as we consider that recommendation.
The first fund that I would mention is around what they call Market Creek in San Diego, where the foundations got involved and put together a fund to help a community build a shopping mall, but they also helped the community establish a community foundation which owns 30% of the mall, and to sell stock to the residents of the community, thereby establishing an ownership vehicle for the community to build wealth. The good thing about that model is that at the end of 10 years, the foundation piece sunsets and the assets are sold to the residents. So the community residents and the community foundation will own it. So it was a fund that we've gotten other foundations to invest in. We've gotten some faith-based institutions to invest in. It's patient money and money that's higher risk that banks wouldn't take. And it's ended up being a very successful mall. It returns over a double-digit rate of return to the investors. The investors have learned to look at the stock market as a place to make money as opposed to putting it under a mattress. It's had a number of multiplier effects in terms of resident engagement and ownership. So putting together a fund like that is a great move if you can get the right players, and foundations have that kind of money if pressed.
You know, there's several examples around the country, and we can get you some. I know a firm I'm involved with just recommended a fund like this for Greenville, South Carolina, and it was going to be geared towards significant new housing development in neighborhoods around their downtown. And normally those funds are, the sources for the funding come from multiple sources. You know, one of the attributes for some of these funds is that money is invested in value-added propositions. So it's not soft money that's kind of granted and doesn't create value, even though it doesn't support programming, for example. And I think I don't. The panel may want to alter this thinking a little bit, but I think we were thinking that this fund would be for real estate investment, real estate support activities, and create that value-added proposition. If you had TIF here, certainly tax increment financing would be one of the sources that you would look at. HUD has a program called 108, HUD 108 financing. It's very low cost money right now. I can tell you the city of Indianapolis just went out and got $45 million of 108 monies that they're going to loan out over 5 years, get a return on, bring it back, and pay it back to HUD. So there's a number of examples out there, and I'll be glad to send you a couple, and I'm sure we have others here that are familiar with this.
Louisville created a downtown housing fund with foundations, banks, and corporations that paid into the fund. It was about a decade ago. We have had, it was targeted at gap financing for market rate housing, just for market rate housing in a particular area. And the money is patient. It is, the underwriting process is just like a bank, so it's not play money, it's real money. The idea was that the fund would sunset, the original donations of the corporations and foundations would go back. No one has pulled their money back out of the fund. They've kept it in. So the fund has regenerated, and it's been a very good thing. And it was, prior to 2008, it was going like gangbusters, and now it's going a little slower.
In my role as timekeeper, I'm going to open the floor up to questions from the audience because I want to make sure that people who are here have a chance to ask questions as well. So I'm going to ask our assistant, are there any questions? Please let us know who you are.
Hi, I'm Walter Zizette with the Tacoma Housing Authority. Thank you for the great presentation. You've done amazing work in a short period of time. My question has to do with the 11th and MLK node. Very, very great concept about the four corners,
yep.
Focusing on the four corners. And the question is, if you had to pick the first three things that you would recommend to the community to undertake in order to get things going at that intersection and that node, what would those first three things be?
Great question, Walter.
I'd get Rite Aid open up, number one, if I could. That would take you a little bit of time, but I'd push them. I'd do some facade improvements if I could. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity, streetscape things, stuff like that. Some of it takes some money, some of it doesn't. I mean, if you had a fund available to do those kinds of things, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. Rather than try to get into the big development projects, you got to assemble all the stuff, you got to get it moving. If you had the opportunity to make a deal on one of these sites that's there, then certainly that's a game changer. I mean, you've already got that going with the hospitals, or the community hospital down the street. I mean, you know, there may be some ways that you can create some synergy, but I would say probably number one, actually number one would be the leasing of the space in the senior housing project. Yeah. Somehow, some way, get those storefronts to be activated. Secondly, I would just push like hell on Rite Aid. And third, I would try to figure out some facade improvements and just improving the streetscape, and then work on the project that's going to be that next project.
My answer is a short-term one. I think you've got to start creating a buzz up there. And the way you create a buzz is by doing short-term events. I'd say you should have festivals. You should have, someone mentioned, a race up the hill. You should have fairs. I like the idea of setting up food things on the corner as ways of bringing folks into the community to get them to see the advantages of being there. You need the short-term things to create the buzz, bring folks in. Then you can get to the longer-term things.
We have a comment over here.
On the way to Terry, this might be one of the areas that you do a focus group on as well, where you talk to some of the developers, some of the private sector folks, and the neighborhood, and get some feedback about what could go on in that corner, and really start to engage some potential partnerships through those focus groups and through that dialogue.
Two ideas. Austin was attempting to redevelop a portion of its downtown that had historically been surface parking lots, single-story, two-story, and it's now 1,400 apartments and office and a variety of things. And they constructed as part of the projects retail, but the demand wasn't there. And the city stepped in, and with a downtown district that taxed itself, the downtown property owners voted to create a district to tax themselves, to create funds to improve and enhance their area. They did so to subsidize those spaces to get the storefronts full. And then secondly, my statement would be get one good quality project. Doesn't have to be big, but get one where it's got an active street scene, it's got something, if it's 2 stories or 3 stories, it's got something upstairs, and people begin to see investment, and it does spawn. We in the real estate business and the development business, we're a herd. And we see somebody do something good, we follow it, all right? So do something good, and people will start looking at it going, oh, I didn't know that could happen there. And they start studying it, and it spawns additional activity.
Thank you. Rick?
I think it's Maggie.
Oh, sorry, Maggie.
Well, I was just going to pick up on that as well. I mean, with the wealth of students and institutions that you have nearby, students love to get involved and do pop-up art in vacant storefronts. You could get some of the folks involved in doing sort of charrettes and visualizing and getting in the community excited about what could get done. And simple things like a storefront improvement program, which has been mentioned, where you could match money for the property owners or the businesses and, you know, new signage, new awnings, a new paint job. It will just inspire the community, and it's those minimal changes, those incremental changes that start to get people to believe that real development could happen here.
Okay, next question. I think Justin and then Lane. Yes, thank you.
My name is Tom McCarthy. I'm a Hilltop resident and homeowner, and I've been involved in an organization, a block leader of an organization called the Hilltop Action Coalition, which has been involved, I guess, at a grassroots level in working on crime issues and also community development issues, community building issues. I guess my interest is, this is very much a development-focused group of folks, which I think is really important. And I think we have an example in Tacoma of the subsidy that went to the development of townhouses in this area, which did succeed in developing a lot of townhouses, but it's kind of dead. And I think that's not what we've been talking about here. So the 80-20 idea, I think, is the direction we want to head. But my question is kind of this. When it comes, a couple of folks have mentioned the buy-in and participation and broad-based participation of residents. And with the Hilltop Action Coalition being involved in that kind of stuff, that, of course, piques my interest. And so my question is this. What are examples in your other cities that you have seen where the participation of residents can make this more than a plan on a shelf, that there's a there, that there's a buy-in? And what kind of ways that the community itself as being involved has actually helped create that sense of making Hilltop hip?
Yeah, we're going to let 2 people answer each question so we can hear more from you all.
So one of the things we've done in Hartford is working with neighborhood groups, we've developed, once we had our neighborhood plan done, we've developed implementation documents that we agreed upon what we're going to do, and we funded those improvements to our capital budget. So we actually sat down with the neighborhood group, identified the changes that we wanted to make. We agreed on how we'd move that forward and funded it as part of the capital budget. It was a major change for the city to actually think about that. But this wasn't the staff dictating, oh, we're going to do a streetscape here, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. We actually, it was a partnership with the neighborhood.
I think you're a step ahead, that you already have some organization in the neighborhood. You already have some groups that have been engaged and working on this. In our downtown, we are a neighborhood. We have 14,000 residents in our downtown that live in a mixed-use commercial district. And we have a hard time learning who our residents are because a huge percentage of them are renters. And I think you have that same dynamic here. We have found that we have had to find the champions in each block, almost like the whole block captain idea. And it's constantly changing. So we're always working on who our team members are that are the communicators in the neighborhood. And we have an email chain where we send out alerts that we may get from our police department. That is probably the simplest way that we get the neighborhood to communicate and the residents to talk to each other. We host, as the downtown organization, we host and do monthly neighborhood watch meetings where we bring someone in from the police department and provide programs. It's where the residents can come and complain, whether they're there to complain that the dog mess isn't getting picked up, or the police aren't visible enough. And that forum is a really important place where we hear from our residents the things that they see, because they're the eyes and ears. They care the most. People, when they live in a place, they care so much more than if you just work in a place or do business there. So I think there's a lot of models around the country of active ways that the cities can work with the neighborhood organizations.
And I think from my perspective, it's really about how we communicate to the neighbors. And I think to the point made earlier about radio station WIFM and helping people understand that there's a bigger vision here. Not every single neighbor is going to buy into it, but if you have a critical mass that's willing to go to the mat for it and say this makes sense for us in the long run, because if we have a bigger tax base, we can provide more services in the neighborhood, I think that's the way to talk about it. But I think a lot of it is how we communicate it. Lane, did you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, no, go ahead. I didn't see it. Go
How
ahead.
you doing? I think you guys did an excellent job with the presentation. I'm Dennis Beaver with the Tacoma Facts newspaper.
Oh, excellent.
And we want to find out, with the Hilltop being historically an African-American neighborhood, where do you see the Martin Luther King corridor development still keeping that focus, bringing in diversity, but still having an economic growth and not driving up or driving out the prices where the constituents within the community can still be a part and still have that focus within?
Okay, I have to take the first shot at this and I'll open it up. I sincerely believe that a historically African-American neighborhood, potential growth, potential vibrancy, and respecting the culture of a neighborhood are not mutually exclusive. And we always have to make sure that we maintain that set of values in everything that we do. So from my perspective, that's why I chose this neighborhood. And that's why we have these people here from out of town, but I think it has to be part of your core value in everything that you do. So I'll let some of our panelists answer the question.
The best answer is that, preserving the culture, preserving the history, preserving the contribution that African Americans, as well as others, have brought to this community is important. The community will thrive based on that. The community will also change.
Yeah.
But it's also important to remember your past, to learn from it, honor it, and then to grow with it. So it should be treated as something that you revere, but not as a limitation on what happens in the community, because communities change.
I would only add, I've been working along the corridor myself and reaching out to the churches, the interfaith community, the AME. I just met with the pastor. Most of their members are no longer living in Tacoma.
Right.
And the team didn't really comment. They own almost 2 blocks of land along that corridor. So I'm actually working with them now to redevelop some of the properties other than the church. And so there are opportunities as their parishioners age, those who wish to return to the Hilltop, there'll be opportunities to have the church partner with either a nonprofit developer or a for-profit developer to develop housing along that corridor in some of their underutilized properties to create opportunities for some of their parishioners to return.
All right, another question? Lane?
Lynn Alfonso with Geoengineers, business here in Tacoma. With regard to neighborhood, I see schools being important. I noticed that there was a bullet up there with regard to K through 12. And I'd like to hear, have you seen examples where a city can partner with a school district in terms of on the economic development, how that might work? The city just passed a $500 million bond for capital projects. One of the schools is here in this neighborhood. And so I'd be interested in seeing what kind of examples we can move that forward with.
I'll jump into that one. I'm a developer from Indianapolis, and right now probably the single most discussed issue in our community is education. K through 12. And as a redeveloper, somebody that is trying to bring back urban neighborhoods, I think education is one of the top 1 to 3 items to bring back those neighborhoods. Young families are going to be the key to getting these neighborhoods to work again. And right now they don't see the urban community with mediocre schools as being an option. Many of them as young professionals live downtown, they start to create a family, they go straight to the burbs. Yeah. So education is critical, and in Indiana we have charter schools, and what we have found is that the charter schools are really pushing the public school system to be more competitive. And so we now have a very healthy tension, at least from this person's perspective, between a public school system that I supported with my kids and charter schools that are coming in and some doing very well and others not doing so well. But education is now kind of the community dialogue, and the city and the mayor's office has really been intricately involved with that discussion. So it's seen as a community development, very important community development variable, and it's also one that is really the future of our neighborhoods if we're going to bring them back successfully and with some real momentum.
In Louisville, we have a neighborhood just to the east of downtown that's called New Lou, and that neighborhood had a very low-performing elementary school. And throughout Kentucky, we don't have charter schools, but we have magnet schools in our local school district. And that school was not a magnet school. And the neighborhood, working with the city, working with the school district, has turned that into an arts magnet. It is an arts district on that side of downtown. And so they have shared parking because the neighborhood needed the parking during the evening hours. The kids needed a kickball area. So it's really been a win-win for the families in the neighborhood, the kids that go to the school, and then the neighborhood development. I think, of course, it's a long-term effort, and how it will play out and if scores will improve are still, up for grabs.
I know we agreed only 2 answers, but I'm going to answer. My answer is going to be a little different.
I don't mind people talking about education too much.
One of the things we did in Hartford, which everyone talked about how important schools are, we looked at the spending of the money on the building the schools differently, and that we put a requirement in that 35% of the dollars of construction had to go to existing Hartford businesses to start spurring jobs in the city. So you're going to spend $500 million, you said $500 million on schools. Well, we're spending about that much too on schools. But we made sure that 35% of the funds stayed in the city by hiring local businesses and local workers. It was important for us. So there's provisions in our funding. Now, it cost us more money, and we understood that, but it was important for us to grow these businesses, and one of the things we struggled with was bonding for some of the businesses. So we had to create a bonding mechanism and how we could bond them to make sure that they could meet the criteria. But the importance of education is there, but also getting those dollars spent for businesses in the city that can grow and hire local residents was very important to us.
And hiring local residents that reflect the community in which we live in.
I'm going to add one last thing, which was what happened in New Orleans, because it was critical to us to get a developer who was willing to understand the importance of having a good school in our community. We did some work in the Central City community. We had a developer, we the foundation and we the residents joined together to go to the city and the education department there to argue very strongly for a good school in that community. Not only did we get a good K through 8 school, but we also got a foundation to give us money to put a health center in that school. We got another group, another foundation to sponsor an after-school gym piece there. We got the New Orleans Saints to help us with a football field for that school. And we've got another foundation to do an early childhood development thing. But it really involved getting a developer who saw the importance of having a good school to making his project successful.
Right. One more question, and then we'll wrap it up. Is there anyone else in the audience wishing to ask a question at this time? Hey, Tina.
Good morning. My name is Tina Lee. I'm with Pierce Transit, and I'm also on the City of Tacoma Planning Commission. And I was very much the corridors, the east-west connections that you talked about. I felt that was very important, and I appreciated you stressing that as well. You talked about 6th Avenue, 19th, and 11th. And Pierce Transit currently has local bus service on each of those corridors, also on MLK. And local bus service is certainly not as sexy as light rail and trains. But what other recommendations would you give us to try to continue to improve the value of that local transit? And what can we do to try to build the relationship into this area as it's developing? Because that helps us and it improves our ridership, and we want to support the community and grow with it.
Thank you, Tina.
I think one thing we struggled with in looking at the transit options was we just didn't have a big picture. But what seemed to be important was not circulation up and down MLK, but connections from other places that are successful activity centers to MLK. And we looked at a bus map, but we didn't know the frequencies. But generally what I would like to see this area served with is a level of bus service that reaches major destinations in Tacoma, connects to the region, with a level of service that supports a lifestyle that makes it a convenient choice, so that the system is not just a lifeline for people who have no other choices, but that recognizes you need to compete with people who have an automobile.
Rick?
Finally, a transit question.
The last one.
Yes. I think I would hark back to one of the panel's recommendations about the radio station WIFM. I've been sitting here thinking, what is a word that begins with K that would fit that for the West Coast? But in this case, I think given the emphasis on engaging stakeholders and bringing everybody into this process and trying to articulate a value proposition as it relates to Pierce Transit and Sound Transit's partnership, we should pose that question as how can an investment in extending Tacoma Link benefit Pierce Transit's service plan? Is there a way that Pierce, understanding it's trying to work through its struggles on the revenue side, can benefit from the investment Sound Transit makes in Tacoma Link? By allowing you to create new service patterns or new connections to the regional system that will help the community grow. So I think we've got obviously a good history of partnering together, and putting our partnership in this context I think could help us answer that question and perhaps articulate some additional benefit to the neighborhood.
All right. Well, I think that wraps it up. I would like to, on behalf of the residents of Tacoma and city staff, just thank all of our guests for participating. I think this has been a great experience, and as mentioned earlier, this is just the beginning. We do have a homework assignment, and I think the one word I would use to describe what I think I heard is we have to focus. We have to have the political will and the courage to focus, to help our community understand that focusing on one neighborhood does not mean we do it at the exclusion of others, but we understand that there is great value for the entire city if we are able to make Hilltop as vibrant as it can be. So I want to thank all of you for spending your morning here with us, and again, thank you to all of our great, great friends from the Urban Land Institute. Let's give them a hand. All right, go forth and make our city more prosperous, everyone.